welcome to my reading of the 5th chapter of I for Isobel. Funnily enough, one of my favourite Australian novels. The last chapter, if you'll remember, Isobel, last chapter, chapter 4, bookended by the deaths of Isobel's mother at the beginning and Nick at the end. And I think the message that Whiting really wanted us to take from that was that Isobel was not a lot better off at the end of that chapter than she was at the beginning. She still wasn't able to participate in the rituals around death when Nick died, and felt very much distant and distanced from other people and their experiences of grief, and that she didn't fit in and so forth. So in a sense, she had gone out into the world and had attempted to remake her life, and on a number of different fronts, in her eyes at least, she'd failed to do that. We might, as more distant observers, say sometimes you've got to fail a few times before you succeed, but for her, she's definitely started out with a sense of hope that she could remake her life and move on from her past. And then by the end of the chapter, she's decided that actually you can't remake yourself. It's too hard. So this chapter is a title chapter, I for Isobel. It's significant because she does actually achieve a form of resolution in this chapter. It's also significant because it connects up with the sort of psychoanalytic theory of particularly Carl Jung, in that it's about her becoming who she is and understanding who she is, that individuation that Carl Jung talks about in his theory, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. And also the theories of Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, that it's only once she's worked through her problems and she gets to the end of her journey that she's able to reach that stage of self-actualization where she's able to see what she wants out of life and what her she's able to look at what her potential is and to follow that, which is, of course, writing. Isobel woke up out of a blue and gold dream, a sheltered bay, shining water, little boats drifting like thoughts. She was staring at a strange ceiling. She shut her eyes and tried to snuggle back into the dream, but it was too late. It had dwindled to its source, the breath of the young man asleep beside her, as it beat soft and warm on her shoulder. So she's imagining herself in a beautiful place, but actually she's just feeling some guy breathing on her shoulder in bed. And the fact that it's a strange ceiling, that tells us that she is sleeping with a stranger and not somebody she's involved with. All of the chapters involve a jump in time and so forth, not in space, but in time. And this one has as well, but interestingly, it's the smallest jump in time in the whole novel. And yet, in a lot of ways, it's the biggest jump in character. And in the previous chapter, we had Isobel, who was, ashamed when she felt the stirrings towards Terracotta Norman, and freaked out completely when Trevor expressed interest in her. And here we find her in bed with a stranger, and we'll just try and see if we can unravel how that's come to be. Eyes open, back to the ceiling, ornate plaster, baskets of flowers linked by swags of ribbon, a stain in one corner, yellow, like sunshine, butter, honey, paler than pumpkin, darker than pea, dirty old daylight if there was a word. There are words we have plenty of, nasty little buzzing insects that they are. Remember this insect. Insects come up all the time. This is one of the motifs of the novel. Now remember, a motif is different to a symbol. A symbol generally means in a straightforward way, suggests something else, exact. But in this text, insects pop up in all sorts of different ways. Usually they're a kind of an irritation. So I guess they're symbolic in that sense. Here it's words we have plenty of, nasty little buzzing insects that they are. Awake 2 minutes and the word factory is at it already. We don't know what this is yet, but it's really important. And you at the loom, zoom, zoom. Now the loom, what do you do when you're at the loom? An apparatus for making fabric by weaving yarn or thread. The loom is like where you weave something. And we talk about a writer weaving a story, and you at the loom. So Isobel's saying she's at the loom of this word factory. We don't yet know what that means. It's going to be a bad day. It's a stain-coloured stain, and shut up. Now I'll give you a clue here. Remember how she often goes into her own head and she's arguing with herself? This is an example of that. Previously, she's been going on about, she's lying in bed looking up at the roof. And what's happening in this section here is this words and phrases and adjectives are coming into her mind, and it's all like this, almost this push to start describing it in really literary ways. So she's looking for words. A stain in one corner, is it yellow like sunshine? Is it butter? Is it honey? Is it paler than pumpkin, darker than pea, dirty old daylight? There was a word. So this is just going round. She can't stop coming up with words to describe everything, and it's driving her mental. It's going to be a bad day. It's a stain-coloured stain, and shut up! Stop tormenting me with these words all the time. The stain advanced like a finger on the soured white plaster. So you can imagine the stain creaking its way across the roof. In the corner, a clotted cobweb softer than dust, like Miss Havisham's wedding cake. Now, Miss Havisham, for those of you who don't know, is the character out of Great Expectations, Charles Dickens' famous novel. And she is the woman she was due to be married as a young woman, and the wedding didn't take place. I think the guy left her at the altar, and she's never moved on from that. She's actually, the house is still set up for the wedding, all of the food is still there and everything like that, the cake and everything like that. So nothing has changed. She's not been able to move on. So in the corner, a clotted cobweb softer than dust, like Miss Havisham's wedding cake. Do we think maybe that this is almost thinking about Isobel and all of her problems, that they're still there, like Miss Havisham's wedding cake? She's not been able to move on. I think cobwebs have come up before as well, when she was in the church as a child, and she sees cobwebs in the corner of the window. She would have to expect a bad day after last night. Thrown out from Kate's place, told to bugger off and not come back. We don't know who Kate is yet, so we've just got to relax and let this story unfold. But she was thrown out of somebody's house and told to bugger off and not come back. That's a pretty embarrassing and awful experience. Well, you're always wondering whether you'd go to Kate's place or not. That's one question settled, but thrown out, ouch. Don't try to laugh it off. It was ouch, all right. Walking that long mile to the door with knees unhinged and each foot weighing a ton. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of just humiliation, but I think that's what she's describing. Just the same, that story Fred was telling was repulsive. Like a long cold snake, it slid meandering through an underground littered with the private rubbish of the human body. That was the sentence she had been working on last night to keep her mind off the story, so her grin must have slipped, and that had given Kate the chance to pounce. But she must have been waiting to pounce beforehand to pick a thing like that. Okay, she was at the bellicose stage, but there were other people who were listening with fixed grins out of politeness. Alright, so this bellicose is demonstrating aggression and willingness to fight. So this guy Fred and his story, what I'm imagining is that she's been to Kate's place and people read their stories out loud, and this guy Fred has read a story out loud, and Isobel thinks it's rubbish, and so she's been in her own head doing this word factory sort of stuff. And these are different people. They're not the same people she was involved in the last chapter, so they're all totally new. So you can see she's kind of cut her ties with that nice group of friends she was developing, and she's in with this new crowd, and there's something literary about them, and she's been going along to these sessions where people read their stories out, and she's just not really liked this Fred's story. I imagine that there's this, like, person's house, Kate, And people go along and they read out what they've written, and everybody sits around and listens, and everybody's really polite. But this guy Fred's story is absolute garbage, and Isobel's there, and her mind is wandering, and the word factory is coming up with words and phrases that she could use, the private rubbish of the human body. And that was the sentence she'd been working on last night to keep her mind off the story. So her grin must have slipped. And then this Kate person's been looking at her, and she's not liking what she's seeing. And Isobel's not being polite. And other people are there listening with fixed grins out of politeness. Not with Kate, though. Who the hell do you think you are, sitting there with that superior look on your face? So that superior look on your face, we've heard that before from the boarders in the boarding house, that Isobel has this kind of look sometimes where other people think that she's looking down on them. If you don't like what you hear at my place, get out. Go on, bugger off and don't come back. You only come here anyhow to see what you can pick up. So this idea of picking up is exactly what you think it is. It's only to see if she can pick up a guy. The hideous speech rang in her head again, and she thought a hearty ouch to drown a whimper. Superior, if they only knew. That superior, if they only knew. I've highlighted that because, she might look like she feels superior to them, but in fact her self-esteem is absolutely rock bottom. That reminds me of that bit where Mrs. Bowers is staring daggers at her in the previous chapter, and Isobel's like, you wouldn't waste your energy if you knew how bad about myself that I actually feel. The funny thing was that Kate didn't seem to think much of the story either, and by the third paragraph, Fred was sounding strained and needed rescue. As for picking people up, that was why quite a few people went to Kate's. But Isobel knew that what was tolerated in other people was not forgiven in her. She very much wished to know why this was so. So I think one of the themes coming through this is that Isobel doesn't understand why people don't like her because of her upbringing. She's missed out on a lot of that sort of education that people get in just relationships and how to read other people and understand what they like and what they don't like. She's basically missed the boat on all of that sort of stuff, and so now she's annoying people and making them dislike her, and she doesn't know why. It's not intentional. The remark about picking people up must have sent this Michael after her to wander about the streets, the conversation wandering too, inconclusive, till he said, impatient, as if that was what they had been talking about and for too long, "Well, you coming back to my place, or aren't you?" You couldn't blame him for being casual, no being the word it was, but still, oh lyric love, half angel and half bird, or 99% bird. She turned her head to look at him, remote in sleep. Delicate, sallow, oblong face, fluted upper lip, light brown crimped hair drifting across the forehead. Listen, you don't have to paint his portrait. So these bits here, this is the word factory, this way that her mind just automatically goes to describing things like a writer would describe things, but she's not conscious of why this is happening to her now. It's almost like she's going mad and can't stop it. Anything happens to her, and here come the words. Doctor, I have this problem. Some people count lampposts. I describe them. So some people count lampposts. I describe them. She doesn't know why she's doing it. You don't think that's a problem? You should try it sometimes. Like 5 lampposts, one after another, a word picture of each, to be handed in nowhere at the end of the day. Handed in. That reminds me of Joseph and Isobel's jealousy of Kenneth having Joseph, a lecturer, who would read his work. So she's coming up with all of these ideas and there's nowhere for it to go. She changed position carefully, not wanting the young man to wake. When they woke, you had to start guessing how to look, what to say, what they wanted you to be, always guessing wrong. From that, I'm really focusing on this word they, when they woke. This says to me that this young man she's sleeping with is not the first, and that there have probably been lots of young men just like this one. might just highlight that, always guessing wrong. She doesn't know what's expected of her or how to behave. There was the young man who had said, "Why can't you be yourself a little more?" That got right under your skin, and it's still there like a splinter, because what to answer? I am the vacuum nature abhors. And not only nature, come to that. I think this idea, the vacuum, a space entirely devoid of matter, a space or container from which the air has been completely or partly removed, a gap left by the loss, death, or departure of someone or something formerly playing a significant part in the situation. That's a really interesting word choice there. It also means like vacuum, as in vacuum cleaner. So is she somebody who's just sucking up information from everybody and taking it in? Or is she empty? I am the vacuum nature abhors. Abhors means hates, dislikes. And not only nature, come to that. Kate was drunk. Don't worry about Kate. That's when the truth comes out. What to answer? So the question we're discussing here is what the other young man has said. Why can't you be yourself a little more? Well, the problem is Isobel doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know what herself actually is. So that's why she comes back to it here. What to answer? Nobody home. I'm highlighting that too because she feels there's just nobody. She doesn't know who that true Isobel is under all of everything else. She had to bend to look at the child in the stroller, had started back from the white triangular idiot face sagging against the canvas. The stout nursewoman wheeling it had tapped her forehead and murmured, "Nobody home." That was Isobel's story if she knew where to tap, not the head. Plenty going on there. The word factory spinning, and what for? Thoughts running like mice on a treadmill, and a door held straining against memories. Going back, I've got to go back and unpack. This, another one of these motifs that runs through this novel is this idiot. It just comes up so many times. I want to look at the definition. I love definitions. A stupid person, a mentally handicapped person. All right, it just comes up constantly in this novel. Isobel calling herself one, or her mother calling her an idiot. I find it really interesting. I for Isobel. I for idiot. Is she Isobel or is she idiot? Or is she insect, which is also an I word? I don't have a total answer for this, but she's talking about nobody home. There's nothing. She doesn't know who she is. And she's now looking at, flashing back to seeing a disabled child, intellectually disabled child, in a stroller. The stout nursewoman wheeling it had tapped her forehead and murmured, "Nobody home," meaning that the child is not conscious of itself, not aware of itself. And Isobel relates to that. She says that was Isobel's story. If she knew where to tap, not the head. Plenty going on there. The word factory spinning, and what for? Thoughts running like mice on a treadmill. And I like that too. Thoughts running like mice on a treadmill, because what do mice on a treadmill do? They go round and round and round and round, and they go absolutely nowhere. And a door, so if you were going to go somewhere, where would it be? A door held straining against memories. So held straining, a door is stopping the memories coming back. But maybe it's this door that is being held against memories that you need to go through if you are going to do anything other than just go round and round. She bolted out of the bed, made for the bathroom, and sat on the loo, staring at a different ceiling, this time as narrow as a corridor and slightly concave. So the word factory. The minute she goes and runs to the toilet, she's somewhere else. The word factory, it starts to create descriptions of where she is. Panic. There she was, exposed to the public, peeing naked, her clothes far out of reach, a horror dream in daylight. She laughed. It was the ceiling. Something about the ceiling, size, shape and colour, had set her up in a train compartment. There was a mind for you, darting about on its own adventures, giving the owner the fright of a lifetime. Lucky you got a laugh out of it now and then. She washed her smiling face in cold water, wiped it on the edge of a dank towel, and went back to the bedroom. There was a bookcase against the wall by the door. She knelt in front of it. Portrait of the artist as a young man, that's Oscar Wilde. An American Tragedy, I'm showing my ignorance here, I don't know what that is. The Oxford Book of English Verse, Pylon, Sanctuary, Penguins, colour-hued to the young man's interests. Drawing a map of his mind's country. I've just saved mind's country. I just like the phrase, drawing a map of his mind's country. What you read is your place. And I heard it said recently that reading is just like any other experience, that it is life experience. You experience things in books just the same as if you actually experience them yourself. So drawing a map of his mind's country where she was fleetingly, she could meet him. Not much chance of that. So she's saying that she thinks, this boy in the bed, wouldn't it be nice if we could, connect over literature that is shared interests that we obviously have? But immediately she thinks there's no chance of that. From the bed he said, I wouldn't have taken you for a bookish type. His cool, inexpressive voice made her think with regret of the blue and gold dream. Her voice became jovial and too loud. You can't tell me by the cover either, you see. And just what cover would that be? Oh, hell, rich with contained amusement, the voice, and the pauses even more so. I'll have to do that again. And just what cover would that be? She heard herself say with mad politeness, Do you like Faulkner? I've only read Light in August. I was most impressed. Graciously, if anything could make it worse, like putting a hat on. More naked than ever, she plunged for cover in a book. 4 inches by 6, dizzying disparity, but old and shabby, therefore her own. She sat staring at a page, not reading. He might have a thing about nakedness. She had a thing about it herself now that she knew what it was. Adam and Eve weren't in it. She must have been thinking about fig leaves grabbing a book that size. He had put out the light last night before they had undressed. She had thought it funny groping about in the dark for the chair to put her clothes on. Now I wonder, he said vaguely, not wondering, about girls like you. I wonder why you do things like this. So I've just highlighted that girls like you, I wonder why you do things like this, just because it's so sexist. And it might be useful for somebody one day writing on that. Why does he mean things like this? There's only one thing like this. That's the question, though, the one with the 100 inadequate answers. So, why is she doing this? So why is she sleeping with these young guys that she doesn't really like? There's the connection with love, the dubious connection. You do it because you can. 2 ways to do it, and our Isobel would get it wrong. This is her self-esteem. She feels that she's just useless, and she does sex because she feels you can do it, because there's only one way to do it, and you just do it, and it's done. You'd like to join the human race on the only level you can manage. So that idea of joining the human race. So she's looking for connection to other human beings through sex. But this purely physical, groping sexuality is the only level she can manage. Because if it gets any more complex than that, she's going to screw it up. There is a deeper reason, but it has no words. It is a landscape, an unlighted desert, strewn with epic lumber, dead machines, stopped clocks, all my own work. Call it inertia. Wouldn't he gape if you said it was a religious rite? Perform it often enough and the god might descend? So she's still wondering, why is she sleeping with these guys? She doesn't know. But she says back to him, I might wonder why you do things like this, but I don't think I would have asked. Who said that? You did, and in a tone you didn't know you could use, detached and easy. Is kind of good comeback, actually. She's feisty, and it's a bit like when Norman threw the paper at her. She doesn't sort of sit there meekly and just take it. She's basically drawing attention to this boy and his double standards. The fact that he's putting it all on the girl and saying, well, basically you're immoral for behaving like this, when he's doing exactly the same thing. And she's drawing attention to his lack of manners, his absolute lack of manners, but I don't think I would have asked. And who said that? She's wondering, where is this feisty, tough girl coming from? You did, and in a tone you didn't know you could use, detached and easy. So she's wondering where this courage came from to be this person. It was the book. There was no doubt about it. The calm she felt flowed into her from the solid little faded book in her hand. She read the title, Words of the Saints, Mysterious. So she's feeling like this book in her hand has given her some kind of ability to be very, very courageous. A feeling of freedom, of stepping out of chains. He said, "It doesn't mean much to you physically, that's obvious." Oh, he had caught on to that. Even on that level, you can't really join the human race. So he sort of noticed that when they were having sex that she wasn't really enjoying it. She said, "Is that a real question? I mean, do you want to know the answer?" She's fighting back again. If he wants to say that it was obvious she wasn't enjoying having sex with him, then she's going to say, well, actually, you know what? You weren't much good. And he says, "I would hardly have asked if I didn't." But he sounded shaken and defensive. "You might have wanted me to know that you disapproved of me." So again, she's been very clever. So she's saying, you don't really want to know what I think. You just want to have a go at me, basically. Make me feel bad about myself. And she's calling him out for it. The bed springs squawked. To be accused of disapproval was a keen thrust. "You're not yourself, Isobel. You're somebody a whole lot smarter." So when she's got this book, she's somebody a whole lot smarter. And that was a reason for leaving him alone. If she was smarter than he was, she could afford to. He wanted her out before he got up. Knobbly knees. Her legs remembered them like sharp, enormous knuckles inside her own. It was a bit sad, really. The approach that was half joke and half quarrel, then working and moaning and gasping together in the dark, and one of them putting on an act at that, avoiding all signs of love and what they had in common, the map of the mind and dislike of their bodies, not to be spoken of. So she's saying that they've had this pretty grotty little physical encounter with no love in it, and that they actually do have things in common. The map of the mind, the love of books and so forth, and the fact that they're physically both quite awkward. They're not going to have any kind of connection. Meanwhile, she was testing the mysterious quality of the book. She put it down and panic threatened. She picked it up and was calm. Amazing, I waved this wand. Well, she had to go and get her clothes from that chair on the other side of the bed, and she couldn't take it with her. What a traverse. But if she didn't move, they would be found there. 2 corpses, dead of starvation, one in a bed and the other in front of a bookcase. So basically, she'd like to get dressed and be gone, but she doesn't want to walk naked in front of this guy, and he doesn't want to get out of bed and show her his naked self either, so they're stuck. She memorised the book, purple cloth fading to a dead leaf brown, paper like dirty old daylight, like the ceiling stain. A little devil thought popped into her head of teasing him into being really nasty. That would make it so much easier to steal the book. How her mind reacted to that one, all of a piece, was astounding, like a rabble finding formation to present a firm capital No, like the harp of Erin on St. Patrick's Day. Freedom indeed. She felt as if she had walked into a fence, a safety fence. She was going to steal the book just the same. She slid it into place on the shelf, stood bravely up, and walked without straightening her shoulders or pulling her stomach in. She had her pride to the chair where her clothes were. After all, he shut his eyes, so it was no ordeal. That was polite of him. She was sorry she was going to steal his book. Quickly she put on bra and briefs, blouse and skirt, found her comb in her bag, and combing her hair said, "Shall I make a cup of coffee? Would you like one?" Frail and pained, he murmured with closed eyes, "Not for me, thank you." Then his eyes opened, seeing release. "But make one if you'd like one. You'll find the stuff in the cupboard over the sink." "Thanks." She stepped into her sandals, picked up her bag and left it in front of the bookcase. Cunning, cunning. and went into the kitchen. Sure enough, while she was looking for the coffee in the cupboard, she heard the bathroom door shut. She listened. The cistern roared. When she heard the shower running, she sped into the bedroom, took the book and put it in her bag, loosened books to hide the space, opened the door that led to the stairs and the street, and shut it quietly behind her. She ran down the stairs and opened the front door onto the bright daylight in an empty street, lined with houses still sleeping, closed on a secret life like the book. I like that. They remember that back to Sherlock Holmes and that idea of the houses that you could look inside and see all the queer things that were going on. That was good. Life presenting a mystery made it seem alive. That's a brilliant thought, said Isobel, making life seem alive. Well, she knew what she meant, if thousands wouldn't. That was the kind of thought that set the word factory groaning, grinding and defining. But for once the word factory was out of action, and oh, the peace and quiet. Phrase you might want to use in an essay, but this something has put the word factory out of action, and it's a relief, the peace and quiet that she gets when she's not having to listen to these talking in her own head. She stepped out happily until she turned the corner into a broad, quiet street of trees and handsome houses that led to a main road where cars were flashing past already. On the far corner, a telephone box. Memory rose like vomit. There we go, highlighting that. Okay, so she's feeling fairly okay about herself. She's got out into the street, she sees a phone box, and memory rose like vomit. Now you remember who you are. You remember who you are, Isobel. You're a pervert. Pervert is to alter something from its original course, meaning or state, or distortion or corruption of what was first intended. And down the bottom, lead someone astray from what is considered right, natural or acceptable. And we all know there's another meaning of pervert. It's really related to sneaky, kind of almost sexual, usually sexual but not always, weird, sneaky, sexual, mean, weird stuff. And Isobel calls herself a pervert. But not anymore, not anymore. Does time ever pass? Not for you. For you, time never passes. Time becomes space in your mind. Crimson pagoda roof, the phone box leered like an evil little joss house for one devil worshipper. Just going to grab all of that. All right. I've just googled joss houses. There's just a few images of them. So a joss house is actually a Chinese temple, and the word joss house is kind of got quite racist connotations. I understand it's a European word for temples in Chinatown, and I think they probably were kind of associated with opium dens and that kind of thing, rather than the actual religion itself. Basically, this crimson pagoda roof, the phone box leered like an evil little joss house for one devil worshipper. So she's describing a phone box, the old-fashioned phone box. Okay, this is the kind of thing I think she's talking about. It's sort of roof a bit like a temple, and she's seen it on the street corner, and it's completely freaked her out. She forced herself towards it, thinking angrily, what made them listen? Why didn't they put the phone down straight away? Well, some of them had, and that had become part of the game, fishing up a victim on the end of her invisible line. And in the end, there was always a listener, a puzzled voice giving the cues she wanted, not able to free itself in time. Collecting pennies for the phone had been a dirty private pleasure, but the best, worst moment had been when the words came, and she shuddered with satisfaction as she let out the stream of hatred, the kind of bang other people must get out of sex. This is something that Isobel has got into in between Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. I think what she's been doing is she's been getting on the phone, phoning people anonymously, and basically trolling them. She's been spitting out poison stuff to them in the hope of upsetting people. And that whole thing, that fishing up a victim, these are random people that she's calling and abusing them. And eventually, if she calls enough people, there'll always be a listener, a puzzled voice giving her the cues she wanted, not able to free itself in time. This becomes almost like a ritual or a routine for her. She collects the pennies and the anticipation builds. And then the best part of it all, also the best but also the worst, she knows this is wrong, had been the words, and she shuddered with satisfaction. That's almost like a description of sexual release, and it's intended, obviously, as she let out the stream of hatred, the kind of bang other people must get out of sex. So she's getting something fairly powerful out of this what she herself knows is a perversion, abusing strangers on the phone. She bent in misery, remembering the calm, scornful voice that said without pity, "What an unhappy person you must be." She had put the phone down, writhing in defeat and humiliation, had plunged out of the box. She was writhing now, the pain as bad as ever. She felt in her bag, seized the book, held it against her chest. So these are memories for her, something she's been doing, but she's stopped. And then the memories, she's seen the phone box, the memories are all back, and then she's freaking out again. The pain as bad as ever, but she reaches into her bag, finds that book that made her feel so calm in that bedroom before, and she held it tight against her chest. Christ, but it was comic, though far from funny. Standing there in the street, pointing bone against bone, book against telephone box. That's an idea of magic. Pointing the bone is saying that book against telephone box, that this kind of mystical, magical thing might do something to help, has some power. But it worked. She straightened up and walked towards the box in control. And why not? If a telephone box can make you sick to your stomach, why shouldn't a book make you feel better? She feels sick at what she's done. Coming close to the box with the book held solemnly in front of her, she couldn't help guying the situation. It was so fantastic. She felt a needle thrust of sorrow, remembering the one voice that had answered her with a cry of sadness. That was the one who had stopped her with a real answer, crying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." She had put the phone down on the dirty little game forever. I'm just keeping dirty little game forever because this one person saying they're sorry has made her stop doing what she's doing. Like in a black fairy tale, the formula had turned Toad. Well, not into Prince, don't get carried away, but into a human being of sorts. I wish she could know what she did for me, she thought. Perhaps she did know. Perhaps the cry, "I'm sorry," had carried its message. Who do we think Isobel is thinking this message, "I'm sorry," is from? Well, she's not stupid. She knows it's not really from her mother. But deep down, is that what she's wanting? Somebody to just acknowledge what she's been through and say that she's sorry? She was past the phone box. Round the corner, there was a bus stop and a city-bound bus was coming. She ran to board it, walked past a few passengers, numb-faced with sleep or boredom, to the back of the bus, sat with the book on her knee, thinking, readable too, which was funny, as if it had been edible. It fell open to a page, and she liked that, a sort of ghost communication. But oh, hell, it was St. John of the Cross, not a fun character at all. No joy in the yellow page, the mean tiny print in St. John of the Cross on self and senses. The soul must of necessity, if we would attain to the divine union of God, pass through the obscure night of mortification of the desires and self-denial in all things. The reason is that all the love we bestow on creatures is in the eyes of God mere darkness, and that while we are involved therein, the soul is incapable of being enlightened and possessed by the pure and simple light of God unless we first cast it away. Therein, what a fat, complacent word. She shut the book, wishing she had one or two of the things the saints had cast away. Wouldn't even mind a few desires. Well, that was a washout. Once it was shut, The book was a talisman again, mysterious. Okay, talisman, an object, typically an inscribed ring or stone that is thought to have magic powers and bring good luck. Book against telephone box. She knew what the telephone box meant, all right, but what was it about the book? The cover? A faded purple cushion, happiness in a room with purple curtains. In Auntie Anne's house. Purple wasn't in then. Purple was religion and funerals. If you did know the charm might stop working, take what comes and be thankful. She's just trying to work out why this book makes her feel good. That's all. That's all this is about. She got off the bus at Central, walked up to the station to get a cup of coffee in the cafeteria, then to the ladies. She had the book on the ledge above the basin and was doing her hair, looking in the glass and hating her face as usual, because she had got so much of it from her mother. Little mouth with thick, full-blown lips, sharp chin and heavy, straight eyebrows, a face made for gloom, people always telling her she was sulking when she wasn't, when the face shaped and softened with the beginning of a laugh because she was thinking those features weren't her mother's. She had the tendency of them for 50 years, but they had been on the go for generations. So her mother had had that face for 50 years, but they'd been those features. They're inherited. Her mum's inherited them just like Isobel has. That nose had taken snuff. So taken snuff is somebody their snuff was kind of like, I think it was like tobacco that was ground up, and instead of smoking it, people would sniff it out of a box, and it gave them a bit of a buzz. It had sniffed at pomanders. I don't know what a pomander is. Might look that up. So pomanders are like a ball of smelling stuff, and I'm looking at this bit down here, late 15th century. So that, again, it's something old. So also plague posies. That's flowers. Flowers that would have been used during the Black Plague, smelling salts, rosehip, orris roots, things she had never smelt and never would, because they're from history, from a long way back, as well as honeysuckle, gas leaks, lavender, not to mention, and the mouth had prayed and cursed, kissed and said, "I love you." It must have, to get so far. It stood to reason. So she's saying these inherited characteristics that she sees in herself as being her mother's, and she hates that. Actually, you know what, her mum has had them, but other people have had them too, and they've gone through a lot through the ages. And actually, you know what, the mouth has prayed and cursed, it's kissed, and it's said, "I love you." So somewhere in her past, in her inheritance, there must be some love. It must have, to get so far. It stood to reason. And the eyes, what cities had they seen? What arches, branches, long galleries of leaves becalmed, sober asphalt leading down to drunken, sad-breathed seas, spires pointing out to the dirty brocade that sunlight lays upon a house-covered slopes. So she's just thinking about the world, really, and what her ancestors have seen and so forth. She loved the place, the world, the vast, the multitudinous, blue-white pinnacles, marble mirrored and still water, lost cities overgrown, mysterious altars, forests and castles, and the great shining, slow-moving glacier, the infinity of skylines, the wealth of the world, and the sense of being 19 years old. Those cells, fruiting so precisely into eyes and mouth and all, every one of them 19 years old, sent her upwards on a Ferris wheel of joy, so that she bent her head forward to hide her shining face behind the fall of her hair she was combing till she settled quietly on earth again. So she's had a moment of revelation here where she's kind of thought, the world's, I am not that pinched, horrible, awful woman. I am part of a vast, beautiful world, mysterious, incredible world. And she's taken away by those thoughts, and also the sense that she is actually, she is not her mother, 50 years old, or anything really. She's just 19, and those cells in her body, every one of them, fruiting so precisely, turning her into who she is, every one of those cells in her is only 19 years old. And that thought that she is, and that's that idea that she is herself unique. She might look like her mother, but she's not her mother. She is something fresh and new. coming out of the past for sure in the world, but unique in it herself. It sends her up on a Ferris wheel of joy, so that she bent her head forward to hide her shining face behind the fall of hair she was combing till she settled quietly on earth again. So this is wow, amazing. She was still so carried away, though, that she went without the book, ran back to get it and put it in her bag with such relief. Shabby little object that it was, she had to laugh at herself. And speaking of books, my book of picture stamps of the world. India, the Taj Mahal, Peru, Cusco. I don't really know how to pronounce that, just like Isobel. The ancient temple of the sun, a peasant of the Pyrenees. It was out of those sober little stamps that the great wheeling vision of the world had come. How strange, a joy you cellared when you were maybe 10 years old, coming up so drinkable at 19. And I like that idea there, that, that's even though it's a joy, a happiness, that idea that things from childhood can be stored away and have them coming out later in life so vividly and powerfully. Feeling buoyant enough to go back and face her room instead of drifting about town, she took a bus to Glebe and walked to the rooming house. Buoyancy was needed when she opened the door on the squalor of the room, the unwashed china and the greasy frying pan on the table, the heap of dirty clothes on the floor in the corner. A person couldn't make such a mess by accident. She must have been trying to tell herself something. All right, of course, hopefully, the first thing that's come to mind, there's a couple of things that should. One is, first of all, Diana, and the way that this is Isabel's room is now filthy. We've got unwashed china, greasy frying pan, heap of dirty clothes, and the floor in the corner. Remember Diana's room when she was at rock bottom was like this. And remember also the symbolism of the room, a place where you get to choose the furniture. In a sense, do we think, and Isabel's wrecking the room at the moment, is she being self-destructive, deliberately self-destructive? And if so, why? What is she trying to achieve by that? Silence and solitude. Silence had started the word factory. Solitude had driven her to the evil telephone game. So remember, in this chapter, she's left her social group. She's left the boarding house, and she's gone into this almost like this type of isolation, self-imposed isolation, where she has silence and solitude. It's the minute the silence happens, the words start to pour out, the word factory, and she also begins that horrible telephone game. And this is also a good quote coming here, even though it's spread over 2 pages. Squalor within demanded squalor without. So squalor, the word squalor just kind of means dirty and disgusting, and squalor within means when inside, where everything is awful on the inside, she has to replicate that on the outside, so the room becomes dirty. She dropped her dirty clothes in the corner and was more depressed to see them there. One works from the laundry bag inwards. Suiting action to thought, she took the bag from the hook behind the door and put the clothes in it. And I think that's that idea that I think she's starting to think, can I turn the corner and start to fix my life up here after a period of things being really bad? And it's little things first. It's putting your clothes in the laundry bag. So one starts with putting a few things into place, and hopefully others will follow. She didn't have to be solitary. She could go with Frank to party meetings where he said she would meet people like herself. I don't try to sell it to people usually, Isobel. I just happen to think it's the right thing for you. You have to think what they tell you to think. But what they tell you is right. Isobel wanted a cause to live for, but could not adopt one. The cause would have to find her. So she's still searching for what's right for her. Interestingly, she's got this solitude that she's going through is not because of people not wanting to be with her. It's about her withdrawing. Sitting on the bed, she looked around her, considering how to make her room more livable. The worst thing in sight, apart from the dirty dishes, now that she had so easily removed the heap of clothes, was the flap of wallpaper hanging loose above the table. She had tried to glue it once. The glue had failed, and she had resigned herself to it, though it nagged at her with the urge to seize it and rip. making things worse. She could trim that off and hide the patch, tack up a colour print from a magazine. She was caught by a longing for richness, for padded satin stitch glowing in crimson and russet, a panel of embroidery. You could make one. Of the dogs of the past that were always yapping at her heels, one nipped her so that she winced. Here's a great quote. The dogs of the past always yapping at her heels, one nipped her. So things from her past coming up and getting her. She still doesn't quite know why. Well known for her exquisite embroidery, our Isobel, Miss Harmon, the sewing teacher. Bitch. Now bring out your work, Isobel Callahan. Free design for a flower in long and short stitch, all filled in stem. Choose your colours from the cotton box, girls. Out she had bustled, expecting praise, Mrs. Harmon's tone having promised the class a treat for the big shining flower with streaks of pink and scarlet radiating from its crimson centre, not warned by all the others with their demure roses shading from pink to cream, the yellow-eyed white daisies. And what kind of flower is this, Isobel? Miss Harmon's lips had twitched. Is it a rose? Do you think it's a rose, girls? She had held it up for the class to see, as Isobel had foreseen, but so differently. No, I don't think it's a rose. The class had begun to snigger, perceiving that it was invited to a moment's holiday. I don't believe I've ever seen a flower like that, and I'm sure I would have remembered. Shouts of laughter, and Isobel not knowing what to do with the smile on her face. She had to get rid of it as best she could, knowing that its slow fading would be the best part of the joke. So she widened it and pretended to go along with the laughter. That had made Miss Harmon furious. She had handed back the piece of cloth, saying, "Go back to your place, you stupid girl. There is nothing funny about vulgar, bad taste." All right, so this is I'm keeping. Now this scene is about Isobel being humiliated in front of people when she feels she's been tricked by an adult, just like her mother's been cruel to her. This teacher has been cruel as well, has pulled her out in front of the class only to humiliate her and make fun of her work. Interestingly, Isobel's work is highly creative and unique and individual, and not going along with what the others have done. And she's been ridiculed for it, and it's been a horrible memory for her. St. John of the Cross was right up the pole, the obscure knight of mortification, of desires and self-denial in all things. What came out of that was people like Miss Harmon, saints that get drafted, compulsory sainthood. Well, she'd put Isobel off embroidery for life. So I think she's saying that Miss Harmon was a shriveled up human being who was just mean and nasty because maybe she'd not experienced pleasure and joy in life, and so was making sure that others didn't experience it either. And she's put Isobel off embroidery for life. But why? She still felt in her fingers the pleasure of placing the silk thread deftly and precisely. Miss Harmon was far away, perhaps dead, and Isobel could embroider flowers in any colour she liked, pink, purple, whatever. This was known as freedom. And I think this is a revelation that she can do what this woman is now dead. Isobel is not a child anymore. She doesn't have to be governed by these people from the past who treated her the way they did when she was little. She began to laugh, then looked at the clock. 10 to 11. She could make it to Grace Brothers and shop before closing time. She jumped up, ran to the loo and back, picked up her bag and was off again, crazy for the embroidery panel. She came back gasping with fatigue after a rush of shopping and dropped her parcels on the bed. A book of embroidery designs. Carbon paper, tracing paper, pencil, ruler, scissors and needles. Linen, silks, no purple after all. Bronze, gold, crimson, cream, pink, olive green, dead leaf brown. She opened the book of designs to the one she had chosen. A stylized tree bearing an improbable miscellany of flowers, fruit and birds. How much she had to do before the desired moment when she would thread her needle and set the first stitch. Trace the design, enlarge the tracing, trace the enlargement onto the linen. Also wash up, eat, wash up, find out what the book meant. Working on the tracing went well with pondering. One thought she had been dodging. Suppose it was religion that gave the book its power. If it was, too bad. Religion was out. She used to think a lot about God. Then one day she had asked herself if he existed, and that had been that. But she had had a religious craze once. She must have been quite small, for the plaster feet with their painted blood and ghastly nail driven through them were at eye level when she had knelt in front of the big crucifix. It had been kid stuff, God the imaginary friend. Going in to pray or to visit before she went home, one might well. She had given it up quite soon because as an imaginary friend, God was limited. So this is something from her childhood. She barely remembers it. That chapter, which for us is quite familiar, where she's, been really taken with the saints and so forth, is just quite dim for her. She's having to remember it. You can't tell him everything. You had to be on your best behaviour. Besides, she hadn't liked him, and the more she had dealt with him, the less she had liked him. No, it couldn't be religion. What the book meant, the atmosphere, the aura. Shut up, this is important. The book meant friendship, company, at least communication and understanding. If she'd ever had that, she wanted to know it. Boring or not, the book had to be tackled. When she grew tired of tracing, she went back to the book and considered opening it. Come on, it isn't all St. John of the Cross. Some of the saints were real dashes, like Augustine, not yet, and St. Thomas More. How did she know? Something stirred in the dead country. I'm going to keep that, the dead country. This is, even though we've just read these chapters about her childhood, for her, this is the dead country. She's forgotten it. She doesn't remember it, or not clearly. How did she know so much about the saints? Not from the convent. She left it too young. And there it was, all bright, little holy pictures of the nuns' favourites. St. Joan and silvery armour had been Isabel's favourite. St. Isabel being a dull old queen who didn't rate holy pictures, and St. Agnes with her lamb, her eyes turned towards heaven, altogether too much of the good child. Those holy pictures were a bright spot in memory. There were special ones set on plaster of Paris with a ribbon to hang them by. Prizes for good work. She could remember carrying one home, full of pride at having done the right thing for once. The book. She tried Augustine first, thinking of that. Prayer. Give me chastity and something, only not yet. It wasn't there. Surprise, surprise. They had the scene in the garden, but she skipped that because it made her nervous, the thought of being tapped on the shoulder, press gang by the Almighty or anything else. St. John of the Cross, now come on, no dodging. She read the instructions for entering the dark night of the senses, trying to give them respectful attention, though she thought that anyone who gave away worldly pleasures when he didn't have to was mad. Rules for mortifying truly the desire for honour. Well, here's something for you, Isobel. Do those things which bring thee into contempt and desire that others may do them. Like wearing a notice, kick me on the appropriate spot. You do that all right. All right, so I think we probably should have a quick squiz at this St. John guy and what mortifying is. So let's have a quick look at that. Just on Wikipedia, mortification of the flesh. Mortification of the flesh is an act by which an individual or group seeks to mortify or put to death their sinful nature as part of the process of sanctification. In Christianity, common forms of mortification practiced to this day include fasting, abstinence, as well as kneeling. So it's that idea of sacrificing stuff. Now reading. So St. John is saying, well, you've got to kind of become more holy by doing things that bring you into contempt and desire that others may do them to you. So get people to kick you, speak disparagingly of thyself. So this is her way of becoming good. Speak disparagingly of thyself and contrive that others may do so too. You're still in. Think humbly and contemptuously of thyself and contrive that others may do so also. It was such a picture of Isobel, the nuisance, that she had begun to giggle at the first one, and after the third she was laughing quietly but steadily. Well, on the way to heaven, and she hadn't known it. So she feels that she's fulfilling all of these, basically because she's being horrible to herself and encouraging others to treat her badly, that she should be on her way to heaven. Still grinning, she turned to St. Thomas More on death. Reckon me now yourself, a young man in your best lust, 20 years of age, if ye will. Let there be another 90. Both must ye die, both be ye in the cart carrying forward his gallows, and death standeth within 10 miles of the farthest, and yours within 80. I see not why ye should reckon much less of your death than he, though your way may be longer, since ye shall never cease riding till ye come to it. That had wiped the grin off her face. Her tears indeed had begun to run quietly as she read, "Young man in your best lust." They were for Nick, for whom she hadn't felt entitled to grieve, but she was entitled. She was one of them. Just going to go back and explain this. It's a little bit confusing. I think he's saying there's two men. So there's a young man in of 20, and so two men going forward. So one man is in a cart being taken to the gallows to be executed. So his death is imminent. But even those who watch him, they are really just the same, because we're all in the cart going forward to death. We're all going to get there eventually, whether it be in just a few years or in many years. And I see not why ye should reckon much less of your death than he, though your way may be longer, since ye shall never cease riding till ye come to it. So riding forward towards death, whether it's tomorrow or 80 years from now, all humans have that in common with each other. That had wiped the grin off her face. Her tears indeed had begun to run quietly as she read, "Young man in your best lust." They were for Nick, for whom she hadn't felt entitled to grieve. But she was entitled. She was one of them. She saw Helen and Trevor holding each other so tenderly, but Mr. Walter too, and Olive, moved by such kindness as they heard the rumble of the cart. That's that idea of the cart taking people to death. She closed the book. It wasn't news, of course. Mrs. Prendergast had the same message, but Sir Thomas More put it better. It was just the putting it better that made it news. Mortality. That's where love and brotherhood have to start, in what we have in common. You belong because you are mortal, like "Never send to know for whom the bell tolls." That isn't religion, it's a kind of poetry. So this phrase here, "never send to know for whom the bell tolls." For whom the bell tolls has a really long history. It's famously a title of a novel written by Ernest Hemingway, but originally it comes from John Donne, who was a metaphysical poet. Now, it's actually not from a poem, but from a piece of prose writing. It has a quite a complex name, "Devotions upon Emergent Occasions." And actually, this is a little bit of it, and it's got another really important phrase in it. "No man is an island." Have you heard that before? It's very, very famous. So no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. So this is about humanity and the idea that we're all interconnected, and that each person matters, and the loss of each person matters to the whole. And so she references this, Isobel, when she's talking about the cart rolling forward and the idea of all of us being connected by death. She then references also this piece of writing by John Donne, which has that, no man an island. Another word that starts with I for Isobel. And part of Isabel's problem is this idea of exile. And I think that connection, we're meant to get that connection, that she's isolating herself. She's trying to turn herself, or feels that she is like an island, separate from all other people. But actually she's having these thoughts and these revelations that actually she is interconnected with other human beings, and is drawing on John Donne and the saints in order to help her reach that understanding. So mortality, that's where love and brotherhood have to start, in what we have in common. You belong because you are mortal, like never send to know for whom the bell tolls. So all that isn't religion, it's a kind of poetry. And for those who hear nothing, the dead in life, her mother and Diana, you could shed a tear for them too, but don't get carried away. Look to your own awakening. So she calls, interestingly, the dead in life, those who hear nothing. And I think the idea of hearing nothing is they don't see other people suffering. They're dead in life already because they don't feel that connection to other people and have empathy to them. You can feel sorry for them. That was enough of the book for today. She went back to her tracing, knowing what she had to do tomorrow. She must go back to the suburbs she grew up in, retracing her steps to see if she could find a memory, a clue to the meaning of the book. She could hardly believe it of herself that she was going down memory lane. Can you imagine what a scenic tour, the corner where she had wet her pants and waddled home with the cold wet cloth sagging between her legs, and Deirdre Fitzgerald following her all the way, uttering complicated peals of grown-up laughter and pointing to her wet socks. That memory encouraged her because she didn't feel any particular shame at seeing it again. Could have been either of the little girls, the one waddling or the one laughing. You had so little choice in what you did. I really liked that too, and that recognition that children can be mean, and sometimes people are mean to them, and other times they are mean back, and that she doesn't need to feel shame about something that happened to her when she was little, and she could have been either of the girls. She has so little choice in what she does as a child. All of us do. Now she put two and two together and connected the agonies of her bladder with the big girl, the class dunce with the moo-moo eyes and the long spindly legs, who had defended the entrance to the lavatories against her, dodging from side to side with hands outstretched ready to slap. Jesus Christ, everyone has the right to go to the lavatory. You don't have to be a charmer for that. She looked back at the waddling figure with a new tolerance. So she's forgiving herself for this humiliating moment where she's been made to wet herself and going, gee, you poor kid, almost showing her own self sympathy. She woke up next morning knowing at once what she had to do, but putting the thought of it away for the moment. She spent the morning washing her clothes and working on the enlargement. At this rate, she would put the first stitch this weekend. The loose flap would still be visible, of course. She was amused at that, but it did not matter since she had discovered a small, authentic piece of her lost self. So this embroidery, she's found a small, authentic piece of her lost self. Great little quote, because it's part of the beginning of her journey back, remembering that she loved to embroider, remembering how it was taken away from her by the humiliation of her difference and her creativity being sort of held up as something, a point of ridicule, and she's recaptured it and said, well, that person's dead and doesn't matter anymore. I'm grown up, and she's just going to go with it. After lunch, she got ready to go out. One thing, it wasn't far to go. As she went to the bathroom, she thought, the bathroom being at the back of the house, this is the furthest point, and the loo being at the back of the bathroom. What a thought. At least there wasn't anybody dancing about in front of it. That was progress. But how far? 2 miles. Not very far to travel in 19 years, not counting work, of course, and some excursions, like that boarding house where they used to spend the summer holidays. But that was different. She had been taken there. On her own, she hadn't got far, meaning that she really hasn't come far from childhood. So she's come not very far in 19 years. She's still really very much stuck in that childhood experience. On her own, she hadn't got far. She put the book in her bag, the charm against phone boxes and who knew what else. It mightn't be as bad as she expected. The funny thing was, she reflected on her way to the bus stop, the funny thing was that though it was a short journey in space, it seemed like a long one in time. Yet she had left less than a year ago. It couldn't be a year since Margaret had stood crying in the empty lounge room while Isobel stood breathing the air of freedom. I'm just going to keep that. Isobel, a year ago, her mother's death made her breathe in the air of freedom. She thought things were going to be okay. and a lot's happened in a year. The suburb she was going to visit belonged to earlier days. She had a confused thought about the city one builds, the insect city with its thread-like paths inside the geographical maps. Where's that insect again? The city one builds, the insect city with its thread-like paths inside the geographical maps. It's very confusing writing. And there, look at Isobel. She's having confused thoughts about it, so no wonder I'm having confused thoughts about it. And these thread-like paths also. The idea that there are I think the way that insects, they almost repeat things almost in a kind of a mindless way. They follow tracks of, ants follow the tracks of other ants and so forth. Repeating patterns. That kind of reference to psychology is there, I think, maybe, possibly. Am I possibly just, I don't know. In the street, there were couples strolling, following their own ant tracks. There you go, ant tracks. One couple had stopped to look in a shop window. In the halted stroller the woman had been wheeling, a silk-skinned, jewel-eyed baby had captured one of its swivelling legs, thrust the foot, covered with a lacy white sock, into its mouth and was sucking it steadily. In the cart carrying forward. Not strollers, she thought with horror, hearing remembered screams, thinking what the price of human love must be. So here, she's seen the baby and thought, even that perfect brand new baby is on its way in the cart to its death. We're all connected by mortality. And then she's reacted with horror at this thought. Oh, that's awful to think of that baby, And then this hearing remembered scream. She's remembering here Nick's mother and how just the horribleness of loss and grief, when you really feel love for somebody, that the price of love can be the horror of grief. When she got into the bus, she was still thinking with anxiety of the enchanting, perishable baby. So it's a scary thought for her, the idea that if you love something, it can be taken from you in that way. The cart carrying forward was not a thought to dwell on. Do not dwell on the thought that we dwell in the cart. She squashed the little insect word. More insects. Squashed the little insect word as it came to life before it could distract her. This is serious. You are mortal, but you must live as if you are immortal. Otherwise, who would dare? And isn't this an amazing thing? Because it's true. We are all mortal. But if we're going to enjoy our life, we almost have to live like it's not true. Otherwise, we would be so caught up in the wow, this is really bad. It's an interesting idea. Love begins in the mortal flesh and must not know it. You'd be like Mrs. Prendergast making offerings to the idol every minute. Sighs and lovely wreaths and little white coffins. Forget it. It was bad enough thinking of that baby dying into a stout woman with varicose veins and a hairy wart on her chin. That was death at the rate one could stand it. One must know and not know. It was evident. One must know and not know. It was evident that there were degrees of knowing, or else think so much of life to believe it was worth it, worth the coming and the going. So the idea is that if you're going to live life, you have to think it's a good thing and worth living, worth it to the point where you can accept that death is part of it. The bus stopped at the top of the main street of her home suburb. She got off and walked. How quiet it was. Parramatta Road had drawn off all the Sunday walkers. The street was empty, and not only of people. Of course, this stretch from the church to Parramatta Road had never been one of her ant tracks. She looked about like a tourist at the old-fashioned houses, the fan lights, stained glass panels like 51s, steps with marble treads and patterned tiles set in the, what was it called? The vertical face. There was a special word. Then it began. All the nameless things threatened, and the colours pestered. Sea jade, chocolate, no word for the sullen grey flaked white of marble. She felt for the book. So this is the word factory starting again. She felt for the book, took hold, and the word factory stood still. She walked on protected. Here was the church in red brick crumbling away at the corners. So inoffensive, why hadn't she gone in, attended mass and thought her own thoughts? Plenty of other people did, no doubt, but not our Isobel. She had to skulk around back streets pretending she was going to 10 o'clock, walking, wrapped in a mutter of thoughts she was too frightened to express, like, I have a right to my beliefs as much as anybody else, but petrified all the time with the fear of being seen and reported to her mother. She felt guilty still, not of missing mass, but of the skulking and the fear. But no more guilty here than elsewhere, less perhaps, because the old building made a statement of peaceful indifference. As she walked through the dim porch with its rack of pamphlets and parish notices, the holy water stoop made no claim, but when she went into the church she understood why she couldn't have treated it with contempt, a church having it over other buildings, in that it was always a shell, so much less important than what filled it. At this moment, shadowy peace and quiet, stained here and there by patches of wordless emotion. Around the big crucifix at the back she sensed not prayer. The crucifix was smaller than it used to be, which was right for the scenes of childhood. The blood-marked feet which had loomed at eye level were now of neat size and remarkably close to the floor. The church broke the rules, being bigger than she remembered. About the confessional hovered guilt and unease. At each side of the altar a kneeling angel held the stem of a bright brass candelabrum, which branched and sprouted candlesticks, each one tipped with a tiny whitish bulb, like a deformed fingernail. She had pinned some furious analogies to those bulbs, glaring secretly from behind her prayer book, condemning artificial virtue, artificial candlelight, artificial devotion, and they were still there, maybe prompting other young anarchists to meditation. There must be a gentlemanly salesman with hypnotic smile and a slight limp behind the counter at Pellegrini's. I recommend these, Father. They are very attractive. You'll go to hell, Isobel Callahan, for laughing in church. She's looking at these candlesticks and they've got white bulbs on them, and she's kind of remembering having made fun of them. They're artificial candlelight, and she made fun of them as a kid, and that's all she's remembering there. The pulpit was a surprise. She could have sworn it was higher and enclosed in carved oak, but it was low-set, unpretentious, with only a faded red curtain hanging from a brass rail. The pulpit, for some reason, touched her feelings, giving out the same friendly calm as the book. And if we remember back to the chapter on false idols, she gets that feeling from the priest who tells her that God would love her anyway. God loves everybody. God, you're a nut, going about like a water diviner, holding a twig in front of you, waiting for it to dip. Yet she had felt it twitch in her hand and was disturbed. So a water diviner is somebody who has this sort of magical power almost to work out where there's water under the ground. Often they hold a stick and it sort of twitches when it gets near water, and then people will hire them to come onto their property, and they get this kind of feeling about where water will be found, and then that's where people would sink a well. She says she's wandering around like a water diviner, getting these feelings about places that might lead her to some kind of understanding of why she's had this funny feeling from the book. She stood waiting, but the pulpit had nothing to say to her, so she went out walking along past the presbytery to the school, and a memory she didn't have to grope for. The terrible day of the mental arithmetic test. 50 questions, and Isobel had got them all right, so she's sitting alone among the empty desks, the rest of the class being crowded around the walls. There is to be one more question each, and the wrong answer will bring down the cane the nun is brandishing. One thin little girl with bright, straight, brass-coloured hair has grey eyes that hold a sky full of fear. Isobel's face is expressionless. Nobody else knows what that word means. It is not being calm like marble, but naked, skinless. It is a disgusting failure of privacy, like an exposed liver. I think this is just amazing writing. Her face is expressionless. She's not showing any emotion. But that doesn't mean that she's emotionless. The flesh on the outside that shows the expression is missing, and that she's just this raw flesh. So, Isabel's been doing this maths test and she's got them all right, and she's the only one who's not going to get the cane and sitting alone. And she suffers from fear, and she does care. Why couldn't you have got a couple wrong? Why did you have to set such a standard for the rest of them? But how many would be safe? You might have been out there too, and you couldn't risk that, could you? So she feels guilt at this. She peered through the wire fence, past the camphor laurel trees, at the neat, pale concrete of the playground, empty of children and ghosts. No ghost running. She had walked first, with the others gathering behind her, keeping stamping time with her tread, and whether she quickened her step or they did, she did not know. But she was running round the side of the building to the cul-de-sac of the lavatories. Poor thinking Isobel. But then what's the use of thinking? That won't help you. She had run with the pack after her, and had fetched up in an angle between the brick buttress and the wall. She had turned round in despair and found the leading boy close behind her, so close that their eyes had met uncomfortably. And after that, nothing had happened. The boy had advanced his hand, given her hair a gentle ceremonial tweak, then stood staring. Somebody at the back had shouted, "Get on with it!" and so released him to turn and shout, "Mind your own fucking business," and to plunge back into the mob, which rolled away on its new centre, leaving her disappointed. She had not been so close to anyone before. So the kids have been turned against her in school because she's been, distant, and she's been too smart and has got them all into trouble. A bit like in the boarding house, actually. She followed the fence around the corner, round the buttress of brick and the sloping half-brick which covered the join between the thicker base and the upper part, stopped and gaped because she remembered the purplish sloping half-brick coming level with her nose. The mental arithmetic expert, the political animal, the survivor, was a little girl, 12.5 bricks high. Isobel Callahan, pick on somebody your own size. So again, this is a revelation that this child that she thinks so poorly of her own self, a mental arithmetic expert, the political animal, the survivor, she's just a little child, little girl, only 12.5 bricks high. And she, there's that letting up of the letting that child off the hook a little bit, not being quite so hard on herself. Another thing that astonished about the bricks was their nakedness. No Isobel there, hiding her guilty face in the angle, nothing but a piece of information, a true memory. Of course, in a true memory you don't see yourself. All the miserable self-images were invention, or at least embroidery. Images she has of herself in the past, hiding her guilty face. So she has this image of herself hiding her guilty face. She can't see that person, because when you have a true memory, you're inside yourself. You can't actually see yourself. You don't see yourself. So all the miserable self-images she has are inventions, or at least embroidery, meaning that her interpretation of them has been layered on top of what actually happened. In her memory, she sees herself as, guilty, but actually, the true memory is one where she can't see her own face. And she's trying to say that what she's done to herself by reinterpreting what's happened over her life has made it all the worse. She hoped nobody would ever find out what a fool she was. As she walked back past the church, another memory popped up and made her halt, seeing a young priest standing in the pulpit, looking with a friendly face at the congregation, talking about insects that scuttled in the cobwebbed cell of the soul, looking right into Isobel and accepting what he saw. So now she's remembering that moment from that chapter. And that was it. It all came now, the calm elation, the sense of everything solved, of peace. She had received the Holy Ghost, or something. Well, she had known from the beginning that it was a mistake, meant for the woman next to her probably. Just the same, having found herself in a state of grace, she had done her best to keep it, and managed it for a few weeks. She understood the saints and their eccentricities, like sitting on poles and not washing, because the joy came first and you had to guess how to keep it. There weren't any rules. How she had worried because there weren't any rules. Reading everything she could find about the saints, trying to discover the secret. She never could have lasted long, that was certain. Still, she looked back at a spell of tranquil weather, the calm that came when she touched the book. She didn't remember reading that one, but she might have. Or the word saints on the cover had been enough to bring back the calm of the season. So now she knew. It was religion after all. How sad. She felt in her bag for the book, feeling nothing as she touched it but melancholy. She had told herself, you have to know, and had exchanged a useful spell for something she knew already, that religion made you happy. Of course it made you happy. That wasn't the point. Where was she going? She was halfway down the main street, past the park. Her feet were taking her home from school. After all, why not? Might as well do the thing thoroughly. Go and look at the house. And maybe lay a ghost or two. So she means there maybe lay a ghost or two to rest. She was going undefended since virtue had gone out of the book. But the whole place looked so empty, so peaceful, she felt she could risk it. She took the familiar turning, though it was no longer familiar, estrangement. She climbed a hill, crossed a road, descended, turned, climbed again. There was the house, dead as a dead tooth. She stood and waited for something, anything, felt only blankness. She walked on. A voice called, Isobel, Isobel. Run, Isobel, run! You put a lady's name in the paper, Isobel. She is going to have you put in jail. We can't save you. You should have asked Mummy. You should have asked Daddy. Run, Isobel, run. Run and hide. So this is a memory. She's actually in real time. A voice calls Isobel, Isobel. And then this, obviously, is a memory that comes to her mind. And I've taken, put a lady's name in the paper, and that she's going to put you in jail and we can't save you. And then run and hide, run and hide. Too late. So now she's back out of the memory. Too late to run past, head down and heart banging. Caught. She forced her face towards the woman who was coming down her front path to the gate. So we've gone out of the memory, which was in childhood, into real life. Such a tiny little woman that Isobel, in her big quaking body, felt like Alice after she had been at the magic drink. Drink me, she could do with a few of the cakes right now. Mrs. Adams lives 3 doors from me. Mrs. Adams was coming towards her, smiling. Could she have forgotten? Mrs. Adams, the bogey woman, was coming towards her, smiling brightly. Just going to keep this bogey woman. Imaginary evil spirit, referred to typically to frightened children. She was coming towards her, smiling brightly. Well, Isobel, fancy seeing you. What are you doing with yourself now? Working. She stopped to steady her breathing. I'm working in an importer's office in town. That's nice. And how's Margaret? Does she like it in the country? Yes, she likes it very much. She's very well. I'm glad. Such a dear little girl. You're not in a hurry, are you? Come in and have a cup of tea. Oh, no, Mrs. Adams, it's a trap. You'll call the police to put me in jail. What rubbish it was. Of course she didn't go to jail for putting a lady's name in the paper. Certainly not at the age of 9. So she had to force herself to follow Mrs. Adams down the narrow, dim hall into the bright kitchen. The ignorance of her parents and the years of misery it had caused her. Years of terror, doing the messages. She had bolted past the house in a frenzy of fear, getting past unseen usually. But when Mrs. Adams had seen her and called her, how she had run till her legs went to jelly and her breath hurt her lungs. So she's had years of terror she's had of this woman and the misery it caused her. In the confessional she had whispered, I put a lady's name in the paper. That's not a sin. Not a sin. No hope then. No absolutions. The priest has said it's not a sin. But if it's not a sin, then the priest can't give her absolution from it, so she can't get rid of the problem that she's had. Sit down while I put the kettle on, Mrs. Adams said. The smell of gas and breadcrumbs, polish over mould, just like their own place, was getting to her, taking her back as the sight of the house hadn't done. She thought, I always expected to be happy getting home. Never learnt from experience. Mrs. Adams got down cups, put tea in the teapot and biscuits on a plate, and said, Now wait a minute, there's something I want to show you. She went out and came back, carrying a photograph album, set it open on the table in front of Isobel, and pointed to a photograph of a cat with a newspaper cutting pasted below it. I don't suppose you remember that, do you? Dear old Smoke. Do you take milk, Isobel? No, thank you. She was reading, her face burning and her head buzzing like a bee in the sunlight. There's another insect. Mrs. Adams lives 3 doors down from me. She has a cat. Smoke is his name. He curls around the corner silently. When he jumps, his name should be Flame. Blue certificate to Isobel Callahan, 9 years. Go back to that bee for a second. She was reading, Isobel was reading, her face burning and her head buzzing like a bee in the sunlight. Now the insect is coming out into the sunlight. The insects being these cowering inside, they're sort of trapped in, and I think that's that idea of once things, the things inside you that you keep hidden in you that are tormenting you, if you can let them out, then they cease to be able to hurt you. And then there's the poem, and it's very good. I think there's some for a 9-year-old, he curls around the corner silently. It's beautiful. While she was reading, a lot of things came back. There's a writer in there, Isobel, a naked infant greased and trussed in the baking dish with an apple jammed in its mouth. So, this is the moment that she realises there's a writer inside of her. But it was a child, a vulnerable child, and that's why, remember back in chapter 4 when she hears about the little baby in the oven tray, and she reacts really, really badly to that. She's now seeing that she's identifying with that infant and how she's been so vulnerable to the adults around her and treated so badly. And then the apple jammed in its mouth is that idea that she's been silenced. Mrs. Prendergast knew all about it. Mrs. Prendergast's weird world was the true one. I won't be a minute, dear. I'm just putting the baby in the oven. Mrs. Adams said, I was so thrilled with that little poem of yours. Everybody telling me Smoke was a silly name for a cat. That was just the way he walked, and I called him Smoke because of that, not the colour, though that came into it a bit. I didn't see the poem myself. My niece's little girl, well, she's not a little girl any longer. She's the same age as you. Well, she cut it out to show me, and my niece said to me, Well, what do you know? Smoke's famous. Dear old Smoke, he lived to be 10, and I miss him still. I often think it's the little poem that brings him back more than the photograph. I was so pleased. I bought you a book to paste your poems in, and a snap of Smoke. But you used to run away whenever I called you. You were a shy little thing, weren't you? I asked your mother to give it to you, but she said it would encourage you to waste time away from your schoolwork. I suppose that was only right. Right or not, Mrs. Adams frowned over it silently. And Mrs. Adams didn't agree with that, just like the parents didn't in the birthday present chapter. Now, other adults see the strangeness in May Callahan. No, they wouldn't want a writer around the house, a witness, a recorder. Now, you'll show all your poems to Mummy, won't you? No hope left when she started calling herself Mummy. So the parents, they didn't want a writer around the house, a witness, a recorder. Isobel mumbled, I thought you were angry because I put your name in the paper. Whatever made you think that? Seeing the answer, she retreated quickly, murmuring. She sees the answer because her mother told her. Retreating quickly, murmuring, a strange woman in some ways. So there's that Mrs. Adams is recognising that May Callahan was a strange woman. Do you still have the book you were going to give me? No, oh dear, I'm sorry. If I'd thought you wanted it, I gave it to my niece to paste her recipes in. Observing that somehow or another she had drunk her cup of tea, Isobel got up. It was very nice of you to think of it just the same. I'm sorry Smoke died. He was a beautiful cat. Well, nothing lasts forever, as they say. I hope they're right, Mrs. Adams. And I wonder what she means by that. Maybe the bad feelings that Isobel has coming from her childhood, maybe they won't continue to haunt her. "You won't have another cup of tea?" She shook her head. She had to get out fast because she was coming to pieces, in great slabs, in chunks, like an iceberg breaking up. She said thinly, "No, thank you, I'll have to be going." Mrs. Adams ushered her into the street, which was almost as unsuitable as the house for the tears that were coming. Artesian tears, rising from the centre of the earth. Now, when something's artesian, it comes from like an artery, and it's gushing tears. The idea is that that they're under pressure, and that once the hole is made, the pressure forces the water out of an artesian reservoir. It'll shoot into the sky. Artesian tears, once she's cracked the surface, they're just going to gush out, rising from the centre of the earth. Where could she go to shed them? Bastards, bastards, bastards. Cruel, deceitful bastards. And here she's talking about her parents. She hurried along the street. Behind the last few houses there was a rocky slope, too steep for building. She went downhill to the street below and turned back, ran scrambling upwards, found the rock that she remembered and crouched behind it. Then she roared aloud, "Spiteful, tormenting bastards." Her father too. She used to delude herself that her father had loved her. It means kind of live in a false state of mind, tricking yourself that her father had loved her, seeing that he had died too soon to disprove it. But it wasn't so. He had been just as bad, with his pompous talk about libel and slander. Libel and slander, for God's sake. The woman owned a cat. "Run and hide, Isobel. Here she comes. Here comes Mrs. Adams." So her father is joined in this tormenting of Isobel over this poem. The tears were coming slowly. How could tears come from so deep, as if she was a tree with tears welling up from its roots? Then they came in a roaring flood that drowned thought. She put her cheek against a rock, which was as rough as a cat's tongue and unyielding, but she was too far gone to feel any preserved pleasure in that. Her sobs were so loud that even in this wasteland she had to put her hands over her mouth to muffle them. When her mind sobered up, her body went on snuffling and heaving along 10 years of roadway. I am a writer, she realises. Too late. It must be too late. The poor little bugger in the baking dish. Nobody came in time, so is it too late for her? Suppose I tried. Suppose I went through the motions. The writer might come back. You've tried that with love. It doesn't work. So that idea of going through the motions, she's tried that with love, hoping that she will learn to love, and it doesn't work. But that was other people too. This is me. The crying had slackened. There was such a feeling of limbs stretching, of hands unbound. She knew she could choose to be a writer. Pen and an exercise book. That was all it took to be a rotten writer anyhow. Good or rotten, that came later. So that means she can be a writer if she wants to. Even if she's no good, she could still do it. It meant giving in to the word factory and not seeing this as something to torment her. That frightened her because the word factory was such a menace. Now she understood why the idea of being press-ganged was so alarming. Oh, well, if you can't lick 'em, join 'em. Maybe that was what the word factory was all about, the poor little bugger trying to get out of the baking dish. And I think this relates quite strongly to that idea of the shadow in Carl Jung's ideas about keeping your kind of inner demons within, that you have to, they always want to get out and they will keep trying to get out until they're faced and you come to terms with them. She giggled, and that was the end of the crying. It was getting dark, and she was cold in her thin blouse and skirt. She giggled, and that was the end of the crying. It was getting dark, and she was cold in her thin blouse and skirt. She got up, scrambled down the rocky slope with drying tears stinging on her face, her drenched handkerchief stuffed into her pocket and soaking through to the skin. She stood in the darkening street, brushing her skirt and trying to tidy her hair with her fingers. Cold, peckish, uncomfortable, and utterly happy. She's happy, having realised what's wrong with her. Where could she buy an exercise book at this time on a Sunday? She would have to walk to Main Street, unless there was a corner shop still open. It was wonderful to have a problem just that size, something to walk up a street for, instead of drifting like an escaped balloon. She was so absorbed in her thoughts, she nearly walked past the dim light that combed through the bead curtain at the open door of the little shop. The man behind the counter gave her a funny look. No wonder, she thought, looking into the spotted mirror that advertised Fulton's Orangeade. Behind the lettering she saw herself, wild-haired, blubbered, red-eyed, and thought, this is the happiest moment of my life. The shopkeeper brought her the exercise book. She groped for her purse and touched the book. That was a moment when she exchanged one talisman for another. This is important because the minute she becomes a writer, she no longer needs these kind of mystical objects to keep her safe. She's able now to use the writing to help her through difficult moments that she has. She says, don't bother to wrap it. Drop the exercise book in her bag beside the book, and went out. In the garden opposite, an untidy palm tree stood clumped against the fading pastel of the sky, and that was all right too. What she means by that is the word factory is here. It's giving her these words, untidy palm tree, clumped against the fading pastels of the sky. So she's no longer afraid of this word factory, and that was all right too. Back in her room at last, she opened the exercise book. This moment will never come again. She means by that this is the beginning of something. The first time, and she wrote at the top of the page, the book is gone. Now see this. I opened my eyes and there's a girl, naked, not a stitch on her. Half your luck. Oh well, I'd had my luck, if you call it that. She was a leftover from last night. But what was she doing, sitting with her bum on her heels in front of my bookcase reading Plato? So you said, what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this? No, I didn't, though I suppose it was what she was waiting for. Mean bastard, aren't you? I could have been meaner, could have asked her for a few words on philosophy. Instead, I made light of it, tried to jolly her into putting her clothes on. Damn it, she'd had plenty of time to get dressed. What the hell are you grinning at? Your sense of sin, reading Plato with no clothes on. Well, now you come to mention it, I did think it was cheek. The Greeks weren't so fussy. Well, this is what's fussy. I went and had a shower, and when I came back she was gone, and this is it. So was the book. And her clothes? Do tell. Of course her clothes. Oh, blast you, just ruined a beautiful image. No, not Plato. Plato was too obvious. Something to get the second young man guessing, building up a whole skeleton from a toe bone, nagging the first one about it. You can see he's haunted by the image of a naked girl reading Turgenev. She put down her pen and bit at her thumbnail, not for the last time. All right, so this is her using, as many times through this novel, Isobel's been collecting and gathering information from things she sees around her and not knowing why she's doing it. And here we see why she's doing it, because she's going to be able to use these experiences to create fiction. And then at the end, the no, not Plato, that's when she as the writer starts to think about what she's crafting and what's going to work. And then she bites at her thumbnail, not for the last time, meaning that the work of a writer can be difficult. She has to think about it, and this is her life from now on, is to think about her craft and how to do it well. The book must go, of course, back to Michael. She would wrap it and leave it in his letterbox. She was sad to think of parting with it, but she could live without it. There were words to carry as talismans, so she's going to have her writing from now on. Did you have a good weekend, Isobel? Christ, was that just a weekend? I met the ghosts of 2 murderers. That's her parents, they're murderers. When I went out for a walk, found the semi-strangled body of an infant learning to talk. So that's what she sees herself as, a semi-strangled. Just as she was learning to be a person, they strangled her. For a moment she felt threatened, seeing the walls of the word factory coming in on her, but she rallied. Take it down, consider it later. So that means that when feelings and thoughts come to her, she can now keep them, turn them over and use them. The boy who had chased her and then couldn't hit her, make a note. So from now on, when anything's upsetting her, she can just note it down and later she can use it, process it, deal with it through her writing. Very nice, thanks. She smiled so happily that Rita said, I do believe our Isobel has met someone. Oh, yes. Uncovering her typewriter, Isobel greeted it with a warm, private smile. So I like that she's opening the typewriter that's been her, it's been the thing that she's hated the most because it's, represented her being, trapped by this machine. It's now taking on a new significance. Now she's thinking what she might be able to use it for. Uncovering her typewriter, Isobel greeted it with a warm, private smile. Oh, yes, she thought joyfully, I met someone. So there's someone that she's met. This is the last line of the novel. I met someone. She's met herself. And that is the end of the novel. And interestingly, I think that this meeting of someone is to do with psychological theory. It's to do with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and reaching the pinnacle of that idea of self-actualization, where she's achieving her potential and so forth. And it's also to do with that idea in Jung's writing of individuation, where the person reaches a point where they understand themselves, what makes themselves tick, and their place in the world. So she's finally met someone, she's discovered herself, and that is the end of that. Fifth chapter resolves a lot of Isobel's problems that were evident through the fourth chapter, and at the beginning of the fifth chapter she's able to find out some of the reasons that she feels the way that she does, and that hopefully is going to be able to move forward with a greater understanding of herself, and has been able to forgive herself for things she feels guilt and shame about. And that's the end of that. I've finished the final chapter. All right, thanks everybody for listening.